Professor Sharon from Flinders University. Professor Lorne is Director of Flinders Human Behaviour and Health Research Unit and leads the Mental Health Research Unit for the College of Medicine and Public Health at Flinders University. She has undertaken numerous projects in chronic condition management, self-management, mental health, addictions, consumer and carer perspectives, and health system changes. Sharon is a national mental health lived experience consumer carer advocate. Family involvement in post-traumatic growth, missed opportunities from living vicariously with PTSD. Please welcome Professor Sharon Lorne.
So the other members of the team are a mixture of people, researchers mainly at Flinders, but also Tiffany and Jan are consumer representatives, who some of you may know. The funding that we've had over a long time has been a mixture from the Road Home and also Department of Veteran Affairs. So rather than give you, an idea of projects and samples and quotes from people, what I thought I'd do today is to give you a little bit of a sense of the journey that has happened for me in this area, looking at families particularly. There's a picture of my mum and dad. My father's been a policeman for about 40 years, so he's now in his mid-80s, and unfortunately is getting a bit more trouble with his PTSD as he gets a bit older. I spoke with a couple of people yesterday. So I grew up on a fruit block in Victoria, and this is one of the few times that Dad smiled, I think, during my childhood. He was fairly grumpy at that point. My mum was always there beside him. So I grew up in a family with PTSD, and then what I then did, which isn't on that list, is back in the mid-80s, I did a fill-in job at the local psychiatric ward of the Veteran Hospital as an OT assistant, teaching Changi POWs tapestry and a few other people doing things. And then in 2002 I fell in love with someone who just happened to have a collection of mental health conditions. And we've just had our 16th wedding anniversary. I've done a range of projects with families over the years, so today's presentation is really my reflections on some of those things. They've always involved mental health carers, for want of a better word. And what struck me particularly, and one of those projects which I did with Jan McMahon, who's the chair of a national peak consumer organisation, the Mental Health Consumer Carer Network, soon to be Lived Experience Australia norm, was this untold story of spouses in the broader mental health literature. So that was the driving force. We've done a range of things for DVA. One was a literature review where we looked at therapies, treatments, and we found that a lot of the responses were couple therapy and not many other things going on at that point. More recently, we did research for the Road Home around vicarious trauma, and that was with first responders as well as veterans. And there's a report that, if people are interested in that, if they haven't already looked at that. Very recently, we did a project in the Jamie Larkham Centre where we looked at the families' perceptions of interaction and participation and the staff perception of participation of family members. That report is in revision at the moment and in press soon, hopefully. We had the expected responses in some sense, where the families were saying we want more involvement, more participation, we're feeling shut out. I've also, interestingly, this morning we've heard about the issue of the differences potentially between veterans and first responders. And most recently we did a literature review for the Ambulance Union. So this idea of cumulative stresses, stresses happening in the home environment. And I spoke with Sharon yesterday, who presented on the Northern Ireland experience, and very much that came through very strongly in the first responder process as well. Other things that I'm doing at the moment are looking at the evaluation of a wellbeing and social program for complex issues for veterans for the Department of Veteran Affairs called the WASP program. And I know there are a couple of people in the room who are providing some of that direct service. I'm not sure where they are or if they're here today. Hello. So, on to reflecting what all of this has sort of taught me, or what I've learned from all of this. So what I thought I'd do was, because there's so much that I could talk about, is what struck me was the people that I've talked to and the stories that I've heard, and all of those interview transcripts that Elaine and I have poured over, and others over a long time. And there's a difference that I've seen in the older spouses, because a lot of our research has involved spouses, and the younger spouses. So, to give you just a snapshot, what the older spouses have told us. They talked about the early year challenges of managing anger and emotional detachment, the social isolation and blaming themselves, which other people have spoken with you about yesterday and described. Reaching resigned acceptance of their situation was something that they talked about very strongly. Suppressing their own feelings. Yesterday someone talked about the walking on eggshells. Holding the tongue was something that older spouses definitely told us that they'd learned. They were very invisible in their community. They were intensely protective of the person that they were caring for, the veteran particularly. This population are also dealing with emerging physical health conditions, particularly in the Vietnam veteran group. So they were continuing to have that transition in their role. They were incredibly proud and protective. They were in very long-term relationships. They'd married often before the person went off to Vietnam, and they are still married. They also described quite a vigilance, and this is people who've been in these relationships for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They were managing the environment, and I run into one of these ladies at the supermarket quite often, and I'm watching her managing her husband's very bad behaviour as he's getting stroppy with the shop assistant, and she's constantly there filtering, managing the process. So what I also see is an intense grief and anger and sometimes resentment, which is very quietly expressed by people. And they have a disconnection and a non-disclosure in their community. So you wouldn't know that they're the wives of veterans or first responders. They're very stoic people. They've learnt to be quite tough, and they get on with their lives. They determine to draw a line with their partners and say, this is what I need. You sit at home, I'll get out. And I'm doing my life. I've got my children, my grandchildren, etc. One of the biggest things is that they're still very concerned for younger veterans, and it struck me when I went to a respite retreat and met a group of family carers. And I met a lady who was a World War II veteran spouse, And the descriptions were exactly the same, and her biggest concern was that she could see the same things were happening for current people. How do I go back? Okay. So the issues for younger veterans, as a comparison. So hopefully you'll see through all this that there are things that we need to do, because it seems that a lot of things are repeating themselves. So what we found, particularly in our most recent research, that the younger veteran spouses very much are focused on protecting children, protecting the family, everyone's well-being. They're navigating that role as being carers, and it's nice that our international visitors aren't using the word carers as much. It's an awkward term. I'm his wife. He's my husband. I'm not his carer. So they're being co-opted. It feels like being co-opted into this illness model, this clinical gaze, which is not actually very helpful for families. What really struck us in all of our data is that intimacy doesn't get talked about very much at all in a lot of the literature. It gets talked about by these younger family members, not always as a loss or, jumping to assume that it's sexual intimacy. It's not. It's actually a relationship intimacy, the person, the connection. That's what they want people to see and understand. That's what they want to build and rebuild and regain with people. They're still learning to cope. They're doing a lot of learning. They're doing all that changing of roles, etc., that we've heard about yesterday as well. They have particular support needs around their physical and emotional well-being, around information, education, financial issues. We know all of those things pretty well by now. There's a lot of barriers to support, and there are still barriers, and they're the same barriers that the older spouses told us they experienced. The lack of recognition, the understanding by services and support providers, the stigma, the organisational stigma was particularly something that they felt very frustrated with. And the access to the system complexities with DVA, with services. These people are important navigators. They were learning very quickly to be navigators as their older peers had learned. So we're on time. So what does all this, what does all this actually come to? We know, we've all talked about the rhetoric of formal recognition of the impact on families, but it's more than just impact. I don't need to be told that I'm burdened. I know that. It doesn't go anywhere. Services need to be ready for families. We need more services and earlier. The issue of confidentiality is something that's incredibly frustrating for family members in the Australian system. It sounds like in Calgary they're navigating things much better. We also learnt that you can't assume mental health literacy is good. I met a lady the other day who's been married for 15 years to a fellow with PTSD who's a veteran, and he's just gone for help. And she said, I had no idea. And it was bleedingly obvious that he had PTSD. And I thought, wow, how can you be married to someone for 15 years and not see? And they had a good relationship. Early intervention in primary care, we've had a bit of talk about that. GPs are great people. I don't know what I'd do without my GP. And starting early in the person's career is something particularly that the paramedics told us was really important in their training through their whole career of including the family. I've mentioned intimacy. Don't leave it hidden was something people said very quickly. It's actually a source of power, of healing, of rebuilding identity and connection for people, helping the person get back to the most important things that are important to them with their family. And to finish, clearly, avoiding the illness narratives, not co-opting family into an illness narrative. Families are wives, partners, children, parents. They're not always just carers serving the needs of a system. So to finish off, just a couple of clear statements. It's not a case of inviting families in, they're already there. So, why not make it a good partnership? And thank you for listening. And that's me and my husband, who's very sweet.